Bitcoin is the ideal candidate to be that reference point because it's tied to energy, and energy is the fundamental currency of the universe. Life uses energy. Stars, black holes use energy. There is no future for humanity in space. This planet we have is our spaceship, and it has everything everyone needs to survive. All the energy, all the water.
Before even diving into anything that all the things that you're working on, I'd love to hear more about your background, your childhood. Like, let's imagine that we're back in time and we're in middle school, high school together. What are you interested in at that time? Starting from the very beginning.
Causing trouble. I was in Atlanta. That's, formative year. I was born in Manhattan, formative years in Atlanta. And ever since I was one of my first vivid memories is looking out at the, whatever the beach is in, I think it's Long Island, and just being amazed. And so, and my parents, were scuba divers. My mom had learned at camp one year in a lake, and so they got us interested in scuba diving. And so, I've always just been super interested in the ocean. Every chance I got, we would go down to, whatever the closest beach to Atlanta is, whether it's Amelia Island or in South Carolina or South Georgia. It was always that was always the best sort of times of the year. School, not so much, but whenever we would go on a summer vacation once a year, drive down to the coast, that's what I was interested in. Always the ocean.
Well, I'll join you on that. I very much enjoyed the activities outside of school more than I enjoyed sitting in a classroom all day. I also feel like I had a little bit of ADHD, so just sitting down all day in a classroom, that was not the way that I like to learn. I much preferred after school being able to go and play sports and just move around, which it sounds like you were pretty similar.
Yeah, we lived in a nice little tucked away cul-de-sac at the bottom of a hill, not like a planned neighborhood or anything, but it just the bottom of a hill, and there was nowhere else to go. So there was cul-de-sac. So there was, the kids down the street had a basketball hoop. We were, running around through everybody's backyards. There was a bunch of kids in the neighborhood. You get in fights with the kids in the neighborhood. Just playing outside, kickball. At the end of the road, you've got, you don't have to pause the game for cars, right?
So if we take a step back and we try and look at how this interest of yours in, I don't even know what to call it, the ocean, just things that I feel like a lot of people early on in their lives aren't necessarily drawn to. It seems like from a very early age, you were drawn to the ocean. You were drawn to figuring out how the world works and how the world operates. Do you think that was more a byproduct of your parents pushing you towards those types of activities or bringing you on these trips? Or do you think that there was something else that was a formative moment in your earlier years that got you on the trajectory and the path that you're on today?
Yeah, the ocean has always been fascinating, right? A lot of people look up, right, to space. But for me, space was a lot less interesting and drew my attention a lot less than when I would go to the coast and just look out, right? The future of humanity is the ocean, where we originally came from. the human body was not meant to survive in space. And so when, all my friends were, looking up at the stars, I was always kind of looking out at the horizon, right? And then I just took to the ocean. I was a lifeguard for many years, coach baseball all morning, and then go straight to work as a lifeguard. And I remember the first time my parents took me diving. We did what's called a Discover scuba diving. So it's you're not certified yet, but I took to it. I was a natural, and I'm sure I caused the dive instructor a lot of headache, but I ended up going too deep, and it was totally fine. I was going 70, 80, 90 feet on the dive, and I was only really supposed to go 40 feet max. And now looking back as an instructor, decade and a half ago, I would have been, I wouldn't have let that fly. But yeah, my buoyancy, as soon as I hit the water, I understood buoyancy innately. I swam varsity in high school and was on the club team at my first university. Just always in the water all summer long, whether it's a lake, whatever the nearest body of water is, I was always jumping in it.
That's amazing. To be completely honest and straightforward from the start of the podcast, I feel like you and I are kind of opposites in this way. So I am much more comfortable on land. Whenever I'm in the water, I'm just out of my element. I was never the best swimmer. I'm much more comfortable doing activities on land. And I've actually never been scuba diving. So when you were talking through that story, just to understand the dynamics of it, imagine that you're going scuba diving for the first time, or with someone who's going scuba diving for the first time. What are the important things to keep in mind for a beginner? Are there certain things that are important to know or understand now that you've been doing it for many years?
Oh yeah, you got to remember to breathe. Everybody forgets to breathe. As soon as you hit the water, you start, you take a big deep breath and then just breathe shallowly. You're taking small, tiny breaths. You're not exhaling, but it's, all that initial sort of panic goes away once you start breathing, right? Everybody, it was the most common thing. I just sit there like, work with me. Come on, baby. Breathe. All you got to do is breathe. And, people say, oh, I'm claustrophobic, but you're actually more free when you're underwater because, especially when you're scuba diving, because you have 3 dimensions to move in rather than just 2 dimensions up here on land. So, and you just got to remember to keep breathing, big, deep breaths, and you'll calm down really, really quickly. That's the key. Is just get in the water and remember to breathe. Everybody forgets to breathe.
It sounds so simple. Just remember to breathe. And then when you're down there, isn't there something that you have to keep in mind related to how deep you go and how fast you come up? Or is that something that you don't really touch on your first time going scuba diving?
Yeah, if you're going to get certified as a certified scuba diver, they'll teach you all of that. But most people's first introduction is something called Discover Scuba Diving, where, and I taught this for years, you jump on a boat, you do a quick little lesson, you throw your gear on, and you're underwater, right? And you're in 30 feet of water, so there's really no problems at that depth, right? We've all been in deep pools, and you can just swim to the surface, right?
Yeah. So then, at what point in your journey did you first hear about Bitcoin?
Yeah, do you want the story, the real story, or do you want the the sanitized version.
Let's hear the real one.
I was trying to buy
We
weed
we
on
can
the
clip it
internet.
later if we need to.
No, I was trying to buy weed on the internet. God, 2012, early 2013. I don't remember the exact time. Just trying to buy weed on the internet. And back then, it wasn't very easy. And so you had to figure a bunch of things out. And that was really my. I mean, I had been talking about it with my friends for a while at that point. And so when I was, confronted with a situation where I was in a new place and didn't really know where to, buy some Pakalolo, I said, well, hey, I'd heard about this thing. Let's give it a shot. So I took the time to, figure out how wallets work, acquire some Bitcoin, and send, right? Just the basic, the three basics of it. And that was but it wasn't really until a little bit later that I got, really into it. And we could go over that in a second. Yeah.
Yeah, it's always funny to hear about how different people make their way into Bitcoin. And out of curiosity, how many did you ever have any struggles early on with like losing a bunch of Bitcoin or losing your keys or just any of those stories that you hear about a lot of people in the early days running into?
No, because I took the time early on to figure it out. I obviously the setup wasn't ideal, and I had to correct some things. But no, I never had that big loss story, except for I had to sell things to put myself through school, but never had that big loss moment.
That means that you probably understood it a lot better than most people at that time. I feel like I have so many friends who got in a similar type of way where it wasn't necessarily from the technology standpoint. It was more so, hey, we're looking to buy some weed or buy some drugs. And I feel like a lot of those people ended up just losing the keys or losing their Bitcoin or not really understanding how everything works and not properly custodying all their Bitcoin.
Yeah, I wonder if I have my the thumb drive that I stuck it on. This might be it. I might have put it on this little guy here and stored, my private key on that and tucked it away for, just a few years. I had, stuck it away, didn't come back to it for a few years, and it was, God, I don't even remember how I did it the first time. I know it was wrong, but I got lucky and didn't lose anything. And then when I plugged it in, by the time I plugged it in again, Electrum, there's desktop wallets, I think, and I was able to just pull it back up, and that was a big light bulb moment.
So, what were you doing before for work outside of Bitcoin at that time before you dove into the industry?
I was a diver. I moved from Georgia to the Florida Keys, where I was working as a scuba instructor. Met my wife; she was a dolphin trainer. We decided, we met 3 months later, decided to move as far away from our families as we could possibly get. And that landed us in Hawaii, early 2010s. And I was working, I came here. The dive industry. It's easy to just kind of show up somewhere and get a job. It's in demand sort of thing. Not great pay. The other option is underwater welding, which I was about this close to getting into underwater welding, but now that it's been 10, 12 years since I was looking into that, my joints are happy that I decided to be broke instead of chasing money and sacrificing my body for that. So yeah, we moved out here, started dabbling with Bitcoin in that 2013, I got to ride that 2013, 2014 sort of wave. And for better or worse, I decided at that point, oh wow, my bank account has, more than $10 in it any one time. Let's go back to school. So I, sort of went full time. I was able to stop diving. My wife had already finished her undergraduate degree, and so she had a job. We had some, we weren't doing great, but we had enough. And yeah, with Bitcoin, we were able to go back. I was able to go back to school, get my undergrad degree, doing research. I did flow-based dissolved iron methodology development. And, I rolled that right in. I was offered a position as a graduate assistant for my graduate. So I rolled right in from undergrad to grad in chemical oceanography, all the while just being super interested in Bitcoin. And then, as a graduate student, having this knowledge about Bitcoin and, of course, talking about it all the time, I realized that, well, hey, I'm, in an analytical chemistry laboratory, and I have this office that has power, air conditioning. I can't even turn it off. And, the University of Hawaii was not known at the time for our IT security. And I was working in this building with industrial, sub-zero freezers, with, inductively coupled plasma mass spectrometers. So we figured, yeah, we could stick a couple of mining rigs in our offices. Me and a few other graduate students could stick just a couple of mining rigs in our offices, and nobody would notice. And sure enough, nobody did.
What year was this?
God. Oh, man. 2017, 2018, close to that run up. I caught the timing twice pretty good. 2017, 2018, caught the timing pretty good. It's all about making it through the dip, right? Hodling through the dip, you end up selling at the lows, of course, but minimizing that, doing whatever you can, and then, just I got lucky on timing. Yeah.
It's always nice when you get the timing right. I was talking with someone actually earlier today about this whole concept of how to do well in the industry, right? And I feel like people like yourself, a lot of the people who come on this podcast have done a lot of the research where if you're really educated and you see on Bitcoin and you see where it's going, then it's a lot easier for you to maintain your conviction during the bear cycles and when the industry has a lot of negative news coming out on it, versus if you're someone who got in only hoping to catch a pump and all of a sudden you see the price down 50% and you don't understand it, it's going to be a lot harder for you to maintain that conviction and hold on. And it's so counterintuitive to human psychology, because the human psychology decision at that point, which is the incorrect decision, is to go and sell everything after it's just crashed. The hard thing to do is to make sure that you're holding on to it and maintaining your Bitcoin holdings and not selling it when everything's on discount and when it's on sale.
Yeah. I mean, that's the easy strategy. Of course you can, if you have, that conviction and what's going to happen, right? You can sell the top and then buy the bottom. That's a strategy that works as well. But that takes a lot more time and understanding, right? And luckily, I had been, I look at Andreas Antonopoulos as sort of my, philosopher, Bitcoiner that I really, everything that he was saying in those early days, every book he put out, Mastering Bitcoin. I remember taking the time to read through that. I was in graduate school, so reading textbooks was, and it's still to this day, reading textbooks for me is more fun. I haven't read a good fiction novel in a while, but I'm super excited. A friend of mine recommended this. It's called Green War, by Stephen Gould and Laura J. Mixon. It's an environmental thriller that I'm excited to. First fiction book I've read in a while.
So how do you stay up to date with all the news happening in the industry? Because I feel like there's so much happening all the time, and keeping up with everything is just really hard for me personally. I'm wondering how you do it.
I don't.
Yeah.
I've got other things to pay attention to now. There's no wavering in my conviction. Bitcoin is the I'm applying it now to my field, right? My oceanographic field, and Bitcoin just has a number of properties that there is nothing else in the world that possesses that. And so that makes it really, I just really don't care about whatever the drama is. This year there's two conferences this month. There was the Offshore Technology Conference, and then there's, Bitcoin 2023. And, I can only, if I want to get anything done, getting work done at a conference is very difficult. So I had to pick between them, and I'm in the offshore technology industry, right, as well, and so I had to pick one conference to go to this year, this May, and it was offshore technology, right. Michael, my co-founder, will be attending Bitcoin 2023, but yeah, I have to be at home base, right?
Well, I agree with you on that, that when you're traveling for an event, you might think that you're going to get work done, but I feel like most of the time it just doesn't really happen. It's just so difficult to juggle everything. You have a difficult time just making it to all the events, let alone being able to stay up to date with all the different initiatives that you're trying to push forward. And we're doing a similar type of thing at SAS Mining. I'm going to be there. Kent's going to be there, but we're not bringing the whole team out just because it just takes so much time and so much energy away from whatever the initiatives the company is pushing forward if you're getting everyone out to an event like that.
Yeah. Divide and conquer, right?
I'm sorry, what was that?
Divide and conquer.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Last year, we had a lot of our team members out there, which was great. And I think that especially for remote-based organizations, it can be very helpful because, if you're in a company and you're in a remote organization, maintaining that culture and that face-to-face time is something that's very important. But this year, it just wasn't in the cards for us.
Yeah, it's a bear market too, so.
Yeah, that's the other big thing is like how are you going to manage the funds as a Bitcoin mining company in the bear market? It's just like more work has to get done, so you're able to ride the bull waves.
Yeah.
So I'd like to dive a little bit into the work that you're doing with your company. What's the name of your technology? It's OTEC. What does that stand for?
OTEC, but we really hate that acronym. So we're going to start trying to use ocean thermal. It's ocean thermal energy conversion, or OTEC, but it's ocean thermal energy, right? Everyone knows geothermal, which is the thermal energy of the planet itself. And ocean thermal is using the thermal energy of the ocean, right? It's in the tropics where I am, it's warm in the surface water, right? And, water has the highest heat capacity of really any fluid. That's why, steam cycles are such an important, part of the industrialization. and you just essentially extract the thermal energy from the surface ocean, right? It's warm at the surface, it's cold deep down below, and if you pull the deep water up, you can just run a Rankine cycle based on that temperature differential, right?
So how are you applying that at your firm?
Yeah, so ocean thermal energy has been around for 100 plus years, right? But just like you've never heard of it until I started talking, nobody has heard of this, even though Nikola Tesla worked on it, right? And the reason is that it has a really tough economies of scale problem, where you have to build big in order to get that cost of energy down, right? That LCOE down to the 5 cent range, right? And no one for the last 100 years has really been able to figure that out. And so, as I was mining Bitcoin in my graduate office using stranded electricity, and of course, I was in an oceanographic discipline, right? Chemo, marine geology, and that was when I put it together, right? At the time there was a lot of buzz around OTEC or ocean thermal because Mackay Ocean Engineering and Lockheed Martin had built a small scale demonstration plant on the Big Island of Hawaii, and I was looking in. We had just passed this law that said, oh, we have to be 100% renewable by 2045. So I was doing an analysis of how we can actually do that here in Hawaii, right? Well, we don't have land for solar, and we don't have land for wind, similarly. The geothermal that we have is on the wrong island. And there's a lot of political palatability issues about exploiting that. And then there's a lot of animosity between, the neighbor islands and Oahu, which is where Honolulu is. It's the main population center here. Honolulu is a relatively big city, 1,000,000+ people. And so I identified what's called the Oahu problem. And it's that every other island in Hawaii can get to 100% renewable energy, no problem. But Hawaii, we don't have on Oahu, we don't have enough land for solar. We don't have enough land for wind and offshore wind. It would be just a massive farm 4 times the size of Oahu. And so that's just simply not going to happen. We don't have enough coastline for wave. We don't have tides, suitable for tidal energy. And so I'm doing the research, there's these renewable portfolio standard reports. And at the very bottom of these reports, there's a little, footnote that says ocean thermal could provide much more than 100% of our energy. And so there was this disconnect where, there's all this hype about ocean thermal and this small scale plant going in on the Big Island. And the only way that we can get to 100% renewable energy in Hawaii, right? Because we don't have fossil fuel resources. So in order to have energy sovereignty, we have to produce it locally, right? And ocean thermal energy is the only way to do so. So why is there this disconnect? And so I started looking into the problem. Turns out there's this thing called the Innovation Valley of Death. I don't know if you're familiar with that term. Essentially, there's plenty of government funding and research funding for small-scale demonstrations, right? R&D work. Plenty of funding for that because it doesn't cost a lot. And at the large scale, the energy becomes cheap enough to where there's the profit motive, and it becomes an easy sell, right? You can get loans, you can raise the capital to do it because it'll be profitable. The issue is that you can't go straight from R&D to 100 and 400 megawatt OTEC plants. That's a big jump, right? And so for the last 100 plus years, no one has figured out how to make that mid-scale sort of OTEC, ocean thermal plant, economically feasible, right? It's too big for the government to just fund, but it's too small to be, attractive for, some company to fund. And the reason for that is that, well, okay, so let's say you build somewhere between 5 and 20 megawatt OTEC plant, ocean thermal plant, let's call it 10 megawatts. Well, you have two options. You can moor it in place, right? Anchor it in place and connect it to the grid. It's an offshore technology, so you build a plant on the ocean. You can anchor it in place, connect it to the grid with a big high voltage cable. Well, the mooring, that's going to take you 10 years to get. Deep water moorings in Hawaii are very difficult to get. So if you want to start today, you should have been applying 10 years ago, right? And that's burn. That's just all burn. And then, of course, the cable, the mooring has cost. Now you're in place. You have to survive a hurricane. And all of these things end up to where the cost of energy that 10 megawatt would produce is just way too high for anyone to stomach, right? We pay 44 cents per kilowatt hour here in the state of Hawaii, which,
wow.
if you're, yeah. All the Bitcoin miners know exactly what the cost of energy is, and they go, oh, shit.
Yeah. Wow, that's crazy. I guess it makes sense, though, but very, very high, especially when speaking with a miner. Yeah.
I have solar panels on the house, so I don't pay that. But everybody else
you understand
does.
Energy too well to pay that.
And and even with 44 cents per kilowatt hour, a 10 megawatt OTEC plant connected to the Hawaiian grid would just be even more expensive than that. 50 cents, 56 cents per kilowatt hour is what our estimate would be. And so that's one option, which essentially is a complete financial loss because no one would buy that energy. The other option is what's called a grazing or a mobile plant, where you're not connected in place, right? You're not anchored to the ground. You're not connected to the grid. But of course, yeah, it's cheaper and faster to stand up. But who are you going to sell the energy to? So this has been the dilemma for the last 100 years. And everybody who's looked at this problem has tried to throw secondary products on there, like, oh, let's produce hydrogen, or let's produce ammonia, or let's desalinate water, and then set up some logistical transport to, shuttle that secondary product off one of these grazing plants in the middle of the ocean, right? And again, all of that ends up costing too much, and no one will buy the secondary product. And so either way, either of the two ways led to a complete financial loss, and so there was just no appetite. And at one point, the government had fully funded the Carter administration fully funded a 40 megawatt OTEC plant, or ocean thermal plant, here in Hawaii, and that project was headed by our now chief research officer, Dr. Luis Vega. And of course, when Carter was not reelected, and the Reagan administration took over, they took the solar panels off the roof and then cut the funding, right? Right out from under him. They had everything ready to go on a 40 megawatt plant, which is right about where, they skipped that innovation valley of death and just went straight to the big plant, which, it took a bunch of time, took a bunch of extra money, and then, the political whim at the time just cut their legs off. So that didn't happen. And And so, yeah, it was just complete financial loss, or you had to rely on the government, which, of course, is fickle. And so what we figured out, I was mining Bitcoin in my graduate office on that, at the time it was 30 cents per kilowatt hour, but I wasn't paying that. And I said, well, hey, let's stick a bunch of Bitcoin miners on the boat and disconnect it from the grid, co-locate a Bitcoin mine on the vessel, don't get a mooring, choose the grazing option, right? Because, Bitcoin mining doesn't require a lot of bandwidth. So a satellite connection is plenty. What is it? 1 megabyte a week. Tiny little headers. All of those calculations are internal. So what I figured out during graduate school is you could co-locate a Bitcoin mining data center on the vessel, take that vessel, move it to the warmest spot on planet Earth, which is in the Indo-Pacific warm pool, sort of north of PNG, Papua New Guinea, and because OTEC, ocean thermal, functions on that delta T difference in temperature between warm and cold. Well, every degree Celsius, higher sea surface temperature you're getting 15% more energy. So by moving that plant from Hawaii to just north in international waters of PNG, you can actually effectively double the output of. Take a 10 megawatt plant based in Hawaii, move it to PNG, it's now producing 20 megawatts, right? So, and you end up roughly cutting the capital expense in half. So you're doubling the energy, cutting the capex in half. And with Bitcoin mining, you're not adding any logistical or operational complexity to it, right? It's, these things are, they do the calculations very fast, right? They run the SHA 256 fast, but at the end of the day, they're pretty dumb machines, right? It's a space heater. And so you're doubling the output, you're cutting the capex in half, and you have a guaranteed source of revenue, right? And so, I started looking into, looking through the literature, finding out, capital cost estimations that were done. Again, Dr. Luis Vega, who had done this back in 2010. So, you do a cost escalation with inflation to whenever that was that I did this. And then now you have, because the Bitcoin network is so public, you can just say, okay, well, let's say I built this, moved it to the equator, and ran it. What would the revenue look like based on real world data from Bitcoin mining? And it turned out that it would have paid for itself 4 times over. And so that was, kind of the impetus for that. And so over a few years, I kept thinking about this, doing, bits and pieces. But it wasn't really until I found my co-founder, Michael Bennett, Michael Hawaii on Twitter, that we really started to look into this as a business. Because at the end of the day, the ocean is the largest untapped energy resource on planet Earth. The tropical oceans where ocean thermal is viable happen to represent 40% of all the solar irradiance that's available to humanity. The oceans and the Pacific Ocean is big. And, we did some, TAM calculations, and we did, we built a business together. It takes, Michael's a business genius, and I'm the crazy, oceanographer.
Well, it seems like you guys are a really good pairing, that you've got the business side, you've got the scientific mind. And when you just hear, like, this is the most in-depth that I've gone into this topic here with you live. And just as someone who even understands Bitcoin mining at, I would say, a very proficient level, it sounds magical when I really try and consider the possibilities of what does it mean for humanity if you can harness all the energy available through ocean thermal energy, and how do we actually begin to operationalize this new energy source. And so based on your calculations and everything that you've learned, what are some of those key numbers or key figures or even key milestones that you believe that we need to cross in order to really begin implementing this type of energy source at larger and larger scale?
We need metal in the water on the 10 megawatt, pilot plant. That is the only barrier, and everybody else. We just got back from the Offshore Technology Conference and the Ocean Thermal Energy Symposium, and everybody else is really concerned with grid connection. So everybody in the ocean thermal sort of sphere is concerned with grid connection, but the super majors, right? Your Shells, your Exxons, your Petrobras, none of them are concerned right now with grid connection. And so the grazing option, not only does it cut off that 10-year mooring time, right? You're in international waters, so the time to deployment is much, much faster. And so they're interested in getting metal in the water as soon as possible because, well, at the end of the day, renewable energy is not going to be able to satiate humanity's thirst for energy, right? There's just not enough of it today. Not that it won't do that in the future, but if we don't want to have, mass starvation, death, either from freezing in the winter or, if wet bulb temperature hits 35 degrees C, which it's approaching in some parts of the world right now, we're going to need more energy. And so what they're looking at as we, as a society ramp up renewable energy and, decrease fossil fuel use over the next 50, 60 years, they're looking at decarbonizing the life cycle of, from extraction to combustion. And then, and so what they're looking at is, and this is one of the things that we really picked up on and that was made very apparent at the Offshore Technology Conference, is they're looking at, we're going to be pumping oil, guaranteed. And offshore deposits, we've kind of already taken what we can from onshore deposits, terrestrial deposits, and we've been moving further and further offshore. And so what they're looking at is they need a source of energy, renewable energy, to power those operations, right? Because right now they're getting high on their own supply, right? They're burning their fuel to power the extraction of more fuel. And so what they're looking at is different sources of renewable energy to power their what are called floating production storage offloading vessels. These are $2 billion ships that extract oil from reserves. And OTEC, ocean thermal, is the only renewable energy source that's its base load can do that. So you decarbonize the extraction process, then you can use ocean thermal to power the shipping to transport that. And then at the source of combustion, you can have CO2 scrubbers, right? So you capture that CO2, and then you take that CO2 that you've captured after burning and generating the energy, and they're shoving it back into the ground. Supercritical CO2, and just shoving it back into the ground, right? You pull the chemicals out, and you put them right back in. And so this, on the surface, seems like a viable stopgap. And they're looking at ocean thermal as a way to do that. And so with Bitcoin enabling us to get to what we assume is a we're calculating is a profitable pilot, once we get what's called first oil, right, on this resource, you at that moment, and you've proven it out at scale, utility scale with a pilot plant, then you can go, then it's, the door swings open and you're building 100, 400 megawatt OTEC as refueling hubs, say in the Gulf, or, just one-to-one plants, because a lot of these $2 billion FPSOs use about 95 megawatts, which happens to be, the target size, right? And this is really what they're looking at, and this is really this is their plan, and they're very much interested. So we're focused on ocean industries.
It's just a tremendous amount of power that you're talking about here. I mean, you're talking about even just the pilot being 10 megawatts. How does that cost per kilowatt hour scale? Just in very simple terms, at 10 megawatts, your estimated average cost per kilowatt hour is X. And then once it reaches scale at 400 megawatts, the cost will be X.
Sure. Yeah. And, most LCOE calculations are all bullshit, right? It's very hard to make that estimate, but, we do have quotes on a number of the key components. And we're looking at based on, again, that 2x the energy, so that really helps, and roughly 50% of the CapEx, including time to deploy, right? You're looking at sub 10 cents per kilowatt hour, which is generally higher than, a lot of Bitcoin mining operations, right? You're chasing that, sub 5 cent normally, but one thing Ocean Thermal has going for it is we have unlimited cold available to us. So the cooling becomes free. We can cool it to, keep stable cold temperature at the optimum temperature. One of our advisors is Reed Browning from Cathedra, and he's done a lot of work. He's the CTO over there at Cathedra. And he's done a lot of work with, optimum temperature, optimum voltage, optimum frequency. And yeah, so sub 10 cents is what we're targeting. And it's not, we're not going to be at 10 megawatts or 20 megawatts at the equator. It's not going to be the best operation, but it's better than anything. Any revenue is better than a complete financial loss, right? And then once you get to, that's 10 megawatts. And so we chose this sort of 10 megawatt because the Dr. Luis Vega did a great analysis of the economies of scale. And the 10 megawatt is right at the inflection point. It's the smallest, biggest size that starts to take advantage of that, economies of scale. But once you get to, 100 megawatt OTEC, and the cost curves have come down because now there's just no one who produces the heat exchanger size that we would need. There's no one who's, building the large pipes that we would need for that size. So everything, on that first of its kind, the Folk 100 megawatt. At 10 megawatt, we can get everything off the shelf. 100 megawatt, there's some custom made things, which of course are going to increase the price. But as we've seen from wind and solar, those, cost curves have just come down so drastically. And we have some, preliminary data that suggests that, this is just a manufacturing problem. At the 100 megawatt, it's a manufacturing problem. So, at the 100 megawatt size, depending on the configuration, again, you're looking at 5 cents per kilowatt hour for the first of its kind. And then as those cost curves come down, of course, so does the cost of energy. So that's really, we're targeting that sub 5 cents.
So you had mentioned how one of the people in the industry who's shaped your views in a big way is Andreas Antonopoulos. And I'm curious as to what types of messages that he's talked about have resonated with you and shaped the way that you view Bitcoin and why you believe Bitcoin's important to the world.
It's a great question. I mean, mastering Bitcoin, that's the one. Um, the textbook, right? That one really struck a chord. And then I've read through all the. It's been a long time since I've listened to his lectures, but it's probably time to go back. And I've read through all of his what's the series? It's been a while since I've looked into this, but the at the end of the day, Bitcoin is a tool, and that's really what I took away from it. It's not controlled by anyone, and because that was the key innovation that Satoshi realized. Everything else already existed, right? Blockchain, proof of work, all that work had been done previously, right? All the pieces for it existed. And it was the sort of immaculate conception that made Bitcoin different, right? Every other coin, all the shit coins, the Ponzi schemes, they all have a guy at the top who owns 90%, right? With Bitcoin, there is no guy at the top. And so you get all this infighting, which I don't pay attention to anymore, outside of, some people are, they yell at each other, right? We're always fighting, right? Bitcoiners are rabid. It's like the Catholics and the Protestants, right? And that's a really beneficial thing to have, is that internal fighting, because if there was no internal fighting, that would mean that there's somebody at the top dictating what's going on, right? So that's the ability to for a country to gain economic sovereignty, right, rather than being at the whim of the U.S., having your currency either pegged to the U.S. or some other country. I guess now China is moving into that space, but the sovereignty, and I look at it unlike a lot of people. All fiat is bad. It's not necessarily true. There have been the most productive time and the best economic system humanity has ever experienced was a dual system. At the beginning of Bretton Woods, right, when you had the U.S. dollar pegged to gold, redeemable in gold, at least for sovereigns, and then every other currency floating against it, right? And during that time, it was the best economic conditions for the developing world. We rebuilt Europe. America built out our manufacturing industries. And then, of course, 1971 hit, and we stopped that, and we lost our manufacturing. We chased higher and higher returns, riskier bets. The interest rates came down, and so I really see that dual system where you have Bitcoin as the world's reserve currency, right? There's a lot of benefits to having a fiat currency, right? If you have an issue, if there's a big natural disaster, which are going to become increasingly frequent, or you need the ability to print money. I mean, it's a huge benefit for a sovereign, right? And but you have to have that sort of stable rock. If everything is floating, right, there is no reference point. You have to pick a reference point. And Bitcoin is the ideal candidate to be that reference point because, it's tied to energy. And energy is the fundamental currency of the universe. Everything functions on energy, right? We we store energy in little phosphate bonds, and we break them. We make them and break them, and we can use that energy. Life uses energy. Stars, black holes use energy. It's the fundamental currency of life, and tying tying the world reserve currency to that, it's a brilliant strategy, right? If you're not tied to anything, well, then you end up with what we've got here.
Yeah, it's a question that I've been thinking about. If you're in charge of creating a prosperous, successful society, you want price signals to be as honest as possible. You want a currency that underpins your society, that is tied to the laws of thermodynamics, that is tied to first principles thinking, rather than what we have today, as you mentioned, which is a world in which we're not on a sound money system. We're far away from what we once had with the gold standard. And Bitcoin, I agree with you. If we're going to go and look into a magic ball and look into the future, my bet would be that you're going to have a world that wants that stable economic unit of account that is tied to real world energy, which seems to be Bitcoin at this point in time.
And it's, I wrote this paper back in 2017, call it the Green Industrial Revolution, and I shopped it around the university to, my professors, the dean of the school, a famous individual, at least in the the Bitcoin community, Dr. Camilo Mora. I don't know if you're familiar with the Mora et al. Paper.
No, what's that?
This is the paper that it's the only paper that Greenpeace cites as Bitcoin is bad for the environment. It was it's really what kicked off the whole Bitcoin is bad for the environment, because it was, Bitcoin can, alone will push us over the 2 degrees Celsius limit. And, it was it may have been my fault. He's
Really?
out of UH. I'm familiar and good friends with the second and third author are friends, and Dr. Mora is someone I shopped my, Bitcoin Green Industrial Revolution sort of paper, and the thesis of the paper, and there's a little section in there about OTEC because I had just started putting it together, but the thesis was that just like the space race can be competed in from anywhere on Earth, right? It's Bitcoin can be competed for anywhere on Earth. So, places that have a lot of renewable energy, and then now we've seen it with Costa Rica. I theorized this 6 years now ago, that developing countries would start to do major industrial projects around renewable energy. And then, when you build a major piece of, a big power plant, you don't build for what you need today. You build for what you expect you're going to need in 30 years, right? And so for, your hydrocarbon resources, that's easy. You just don't burn the additional fuel, right? And so it doesn't really cost that much. But for renewable resources, where you have a near zero cost for marginal cost, that's a huge problem, because now you're subsidizing all of that curtailed capacity with the smaller amount of energy. So you get increased cost of energy. But what Bitcoin allows you to do is to build that big piece of infrastructure. Even if you're using just a small amount of it, you can monetize that full capacity, right? And that, developing nations who have, either don't have their own currency or have a currency that is, subject to wild fluctuations, inflation, etc., they would look to, start to harness the natural energy that they have available to them, whether it be sun or hydro or geo or wind or tidal, whatever they have. And then as they build, then you build out that capacity, right? Humanity and civilization was built around the, transport hubs, the coast, along rivers. But modern society, right? We figured that out. We have trains, we have, major shipping. We can get goods from where we need to be, from where we are to where they need to be, relatively simply and cheaply. Modern society is built around energy. And so if you, think Field of Dreams, if you build it, they will come. So if you can build, a gigawatt of hydropower, even if the local, population only needs 20, 50 megawatts, because that cheap energy, right? If you're able to monetize a full gigawatt of, say hydropower, well, now the cost of that energy is so cheap that you're going to have an influx, right? And this is really what's needed to weather the worst effects of climate change. Is people need to go where the energy is, because those are the places that are going to be most resilient to flooding, tidal, incursions, saltwater incursions into the aquifers, hurricanes. And so society needs to have, but of course you can't be prescriptive. You can't force someone to say, hey, you got to move there. You got to make it so attractive, right, that there's just it just becomes obvious, and that they seek out that lowest cost of energy. And then, and Bitcoin is the key to doing that. And that was kind of the thesis of this paper, is that you'll start seeing these hubs, and people will build the energy resource before the society is there, before the rest of the infrastructure is there. You monetize it during the early days with Bitcoin, and then you start to build around it, right? Just like with transport hubs. And OTEC, there's a little section that's like, OTEC is ideal for this as well. But yeah, and I took that paper. I had, talked about this with the second and third author, who are, fantastic people. And then I took it to Camille Amora, and those second and third authors were the TAs, the teaching assistants in the class. There's an undergraduate class that wrote the paper and decided to write it, but they took that idea, proposed it to the class as their assignment for the semester, right? It was how to publish papers, learn about the publishing process, and so I inadvertently spawned this paper that is now plaguing us. So I feel like a personal responsibility to sort of put an end to that, right?
Well, that's a very, very interesting story. One piece that I really want to get your take on is a question that I've been trying to figure out the answer to myself. And so, as someone from your perspective would it be fair to categorize you as a climate scientist?
I'm an oceanographer. That is, yeah.
Okay, yeah. So as someone with that type of background who understands the literature, and I believe you fall into the camp of people that say unequivocally the scientific consensus that you have around the world is that climate change is real. The question is how we address it. With that question in the mind's eye, and then covering everything that we touched on with energy consumption being important, how do you balance this in your thinking, right? One being that climate change is real, climate change is bad, and we've got to address it. But simultaneously, energy consumption is good for humanity. We want to make sure that we increase humanity's energy consumption in order to better the standard of living around the world. because a lot of people look at one side of this equation and you'll see them say, look, climate change is bad, climate change is real. We need to prohibit the development of energy capacity in these other parts of the world. And simultaneously, many of the people who are promoting this type of thinking are consuming over 30 times as much energy as some of the areas in which they're trying to prevent the development of energy resources. And this is a very nuanced question, a very nuanced point. And I don't think that there is a tried and true right answer, like this person's right, this person's wrong. But it's something that I've been trying to wrap my brain around and try and figure out, okay, we've got these big problems, we've got these technologies, and we've got these goals and solutions. How do you solve it? And I feel like you're someone that would be a great person to go and tackle that question with.
Yeah, and I mean that exact question is why me and Michael started this business, right? The issue is that there are 3.2 to 3.4 billion people who are at risk of the deleterious effects of climate change, right, going into the future. And this year El Nino is about to hit us like a son of a Southeast Asia is hitting all-time high in temperature records. We're pushing the wet bulb temperature to, if wet bulb hits 35 degrees Celsius, thousands of people will die of heat.
Can you explain that? Because I personally don't know what that term, like the terminology means and the ramifications of it.
Sure. So you have your thermometer, right? And it says, right now my thermometer says in here I keep it nice at about 68 because I'm a big hairy guy. But you also have to take into effect wind. You have to take into effect humidity. And so wet bulb temperature is a thermometer with essentially a wet, damp cloth around it, right? And because if it's hot, that water starts to evaporate. And when you evaporate, right, that has a cooling effect on the environment around it. So that, you have the wet, like a wet cloth around a temperature, a thermometer. As, the heat causes it to evaporate, that has a cooling effect. So it's slightly lower than, the ambient temperature, right? And the human body starts to break down, right? That's what sweat's for. That's what the body does with sweat, right? It's a cooling effect, and it's one of humanity's superpowers. And so, but the human body stops functioning at around 35 degrees Celsius when you're measuring that wet bulb temperature, right? So, and then that's with, roughly 100% humidity. If it's 44 degrees like it was in Vietnam, Celsius, that's Celsius, right? So what is that? 100, 110, 115? I don't know. I don't really deal with the imperial system
very hot.
It's pretty dumb. And a lot of people don't have, air conditioning. They can't sit. I live in Hawaii. It's humid as hell. Sit in a room with, AC. People don't have that, right? And it's just wrong to say, hey, as the developing world, we're in, I'm a U.S. and Canadian citizen. We went in, we discovered, oil. We went into the world and extracted all that easy, sweet crude that bubbles up to the surface. We went around the world and stole all of it to industrialize ourselves, right, over the last 150 years, right? All that easy energy is not there anymore. And so, how do we, as a society, as the developing world, say, hey, look, sorry, you can't industrialize, right? That's just wrong. We can't do that, right? We can't say, I'm sorry, if you guys burn as much fossil fuel, as much hydrocarbons as we did, well, then we all die, right? That's kind of the it's not that we all die, but civilization, are globally spanning interconnected civilization, will that social structure breaks down if they start to industrialize at the same scale using the same fuels as we did. But well, they don't. There's not enough. There aren't enough hydrocarbons left to do that for them anyway, right? If the 6 billion people who don't have access to the same amount of energy as we do in the developing world, there's simply not enough hydrocarbons to do that. And I mean, it's completely unreasonable at this point to say, oh, yeah, we're going to build natural gas pipelines through the Saharan desert, through regions of political conflict, right? That's a recipe for a disaster. One, natural gas is incredibly capital intensive, requires a lot of infrastructure, and the places that need that energy, it's the last major source of energy. That there's a lot. It's the largest remaining source of energy, natural gas, but you can't build that infrastructure in a lot of these places. So, when we look at the developing world and how they've sort of adapted to this this problem before, with us, we had telephone cables, right? We had railroads, telephone, you built the telephone and telegraph lines along the railroads. We built cars, road infrastructure, right? You can't, again, similar kind of infrastructure problem where a lot of the places that many, many people live don't have the ability to, build that infrastructure. Think like, in Europe where, the cart, we had horse-drawn carriages, right? Because we had the landscape, the climate that facilitated that road. And a lot of people, in the developing world say, oh, well, a lot of these civilizations didn't invent the wheel, or no, they invented the wheel. The camel was a superior technology for them where they were because, the camel doesn't need water. It doesn't break down. You don't have to build roads. It can walk through the desert for hundreds and hundreds of miles, right? The camel was a far superior technology for the areas where the camel was adopted. So when you think about, again, 1,000 years ago, right? They had the wheel in selective locations, but they adopted the camel. And so when you look at modern society, well, the developing world did not build out the telephone infrastructure, right? They leapfrogged the technology straight to cell phones. And so distributed, right? Instead of centralized infrastructure, distributed sources. So in a similar, manner, I look at with energy, right? And renewable energy is distributed, right? It's not everywhere. The same energy resource isn't everywhere. But having you can now build, solar panels. You can have a PV infrastructure in a far-flung village, right? Providing them, and not everybody at the moment needs 24/7 renewable, base load energy, right? It's great, but at the moment they have zero energy, and so getting some energy and then building out that is really in a distributed fashion. And then, on the other hand, it's like, well, you don't have, again, OTEC does work in the tropics, so there's about 1 billion human beings that directly can benefit from ocean thermal resources as a base load, right? Most people live on the coast in the tropics. Ocean thermal is perfect for there. But for a lot of the far-flung villages, again, most of humanity lives in the tropics. They do have solar resources available. And so one of the industries that we're targeting is the deep sea mining operations. There's these little polymetallic nodules like this that contain all the cobalt manganese, copper, nickel that's required, right? There's $60 trillion worth of those minerals sitting on the seafloor, right on the seabed. They're not buried underneath, they're just sitting flush on the seafloor. And we don't have enough terrestrial resources to build all that PV infrastructure, to build all those batteries, right? And make it cheap and not use slave labor in the Congo, right? And so one of the, offshore industries that we're targeting, for the future is being able to provide power to these deep sea mining operations, because there are the resources in the ocean, and it's far less, impactful than, clear cutting the Congo, right? Or the way nickel and manganese are, mined. And it can be done, it's done far more ethically, and it really represents, outside of Bitcoin, it represents the really the most equitable distribution of wealth that humanity has ever seen, because it's the common resource of humanity. So there's been an effort to make sure that developing worlds have access to certain plots of land or seafloor that they can then extract the minerals. And energy abundance is the key. So we have to get them energy, and the way that we did it as in the developing world isn't going to work for them, right? Everywhere is different, right? And you have to go distributed, and renewable energy is the key, right? You get people start migrating as their crops fail, as the rain patterns change, or flooding. They start to seek out lower costs of energy, which are only going to be renewable energy, because if we start to burn more, the cost of energy on hydrocarbons is just going to keep going up, right? I don't know what you're paying for gas. I know what I'm paying. The state of Hawaii pays 44 cents per kilowatt hour for our fossil fuels energy. They can't handle that. That's never going to work for them. But zero marginal cost energy sources, those do work for them, right? It's a tough situation. That's why me and Michael are building this business, is because we can have just a huge effect on energy prosperity around the globe, and Bitcoin is the catalyst for it.
That's a very interesting perspective, and I think that one of the key points, if I was to say this back, that I hadn't really thought of in terms of this analogy, but I think that you laid it out very well, is just like how the developing world leapfrogs us in certain technologies, just like with another example of that is online banking, but you could talk about cellular access, whatever it may be. In the energy sector, you have a leapfrogging technology with renewables where the marginal cost of electricity is trending towards being virtually free. So that is the technology that they're going to and should leverage to leapfrog us, who are reliant or more reliant on non-renewable energy sources. Did I say that back correctly?
That is absolutely correct. And we can afford in the developing world to, as I laid out, decarbonizing the entire life cycle of hydrocarbons, right? From extraction to combustion. And then literally what they're doing is they're shoving it back into the ground, supercritical CO2 cycles, right? Shoving those molecules back into the ground after we took them out and burned them. We can stomach that a lot better than they can. And we have, in the developing world, sort of an obligation to assist our, fellow humans. Because at the end of the day, again, I look out at the horizon. I don't look up at the stars. There is no future for humanity in space. This planet we have is our spaceship, and it has everything everyone needs to survive. All the water, all the energy. I mean, the solar irradiance alone, with less than with 0.1% of all the solar irradiance that hits the planet, if we can harvest that, we have so much energy. And it comes back to grid infrastructure, right? Being able to move energy to where it's needed. And what Europe is doing now is they're looking at building out a common grid so that when it's sunny in the summer, Southern Europe is providing energy to the north, and when it's windy during the winter, the North Sea is generating so much energy that it pumps it down to Southern Europe. And that's just on a regional scale. That really needs to be built out at the continent scale, right? The hemisphere scale. And so one of the interesting long-term applications and kind of the outside of the ocean industries market, the really long-term vision for how OTEC can really help the world is not necessarily directly powering the grid, but what we call the string of pearls strategy, with I think it's roughly 250 ocean thermal plants, all located at the equator, so there's no hurricanes to deal with, connected with all connected in a row with a high voltage cable, and so when it's sunny on one side of the planet, the energy can travel across the ocean. Now, because you have a daisy chained power plants, you're not getting those huge, massive losses that you would expect in transporting energy, far. When it's sunny on one side, you're pumping energy to the other side, right? And amplifying it along the way with, these ocean thermal plants, roughly every 25 kilometers. And then when it's, when the sun goes to the other side of the planet, you just reverse the direction, right? And you can have this, through the Pacific, the Indian, the Atlantic Ocean, connecting all the grids, right? And that's really kind of the vision that we see.
Hearing you talk about that is, first off, mind-blowing, but it almost it reminds me of a conversation I was having the other day where I'll have it with you right now. Imagine that you're dropped on an island, right? And you're the first human. The world that you're seeing at that point in time is just unbelievable. The world compared to the world that we're living in today. Like the world we're living in today, it's pretty incredible to think about what our species has created. Look at what we're doing right here, having this podcast that other people are going to be able to tune into and listen to and don't have to be around for, pause, rewind, go forward. Just unbelievable technology. How many years do you think it would take for you and a group of 10 people to actually start to begin to build the world that we have around us today?
Whew. Thousands.
I don't think I'd ever be.
We know how long it took. It took, I think, agriculture. It was 200,000 years ago, right? That was the first advent of agriculture, and then you get specialization, and you just continue to build. I think about. I think about what would have happened if Rome hadn't collapsed and, all that knowledge just lost. If they had discovered calculus, if we had already had calculus, 1,000 years before, but it's trial and error, right? And that takes a long time. It takes a long time to evolve. That's how we got here, right? If from the mud that or the deep sea vents that that life sprang from, reducing iron to where we are today took billions of years, right? But then you get, it's compounding. So you get explosion of, you get the Cambrian explosion, you get the Industrial Revolution, similar.
Yeah, that was the first question that came to my mind as I was hearing you talk about how we're going to have this interconnected system where the sun on one side is powering and that energy can move to the other side. I'm just thinking in my mind, how in the world do we build this? Like, when do you see that vision coming to fruition, where we're able to harness that type of energy and transport it in a system similar to what you just explained?
So we're going to get to first oil on ocean thermal energy by the end of the decade. Our target is 2027, 2028. Then you add in some buffer zone, of course, because always things go wrong.
It always takes longer.
By end of the decade, we're getting to first oil. From there, we're building 100 megawatts with the first one. The second one takes a lot shorter time, right? You've built out the 10 megawatt happens to be a single module of a modular system. So once the 10 megawatt is done, then you just duplicate, right? You string 10 of those together, you get 100 megawatts, right? So the second one, we're looking at 32. You start with the offshore industries, powering FPSOs, powering deep sea mining operations, and a lot of that starts to come online, really ramp up through the 2030s, 2040, 2050. And then as you start, shifting the shipping industry starts decarbonizing. You use what's called the truck stop of the ocean model, where you have a bunch of refueling plants. Instead of building hydrogen infrastructure or ammonia infrastructure or methanol production on land at every single port in the world, that's just ridiculous. You centralize that infrastructure to large-scale OTEC plants at the equator, right? So you start building those 400 megawatt OTEC ocean thermal plants at the equator. You're producing methanol for the shipping industry, right? And instead of refueling at port, you're refueling in transit. And as you start building that infrastructure out, you build one at a time, and then you start connecting them. So, you can have one of these plants roughly, it harvests the thermal energy from around a 25 square kilometer region. Think, solar plants, right? A PV farm, 25 square kilometers, and that's roughly, instead of having all that infrastructure in the ocean, you just use the water as that PV infrastructure. So it's centralized. You start with them, every 100 kilometers. So then you only need, 50 of these things. And we have the pipe, we have the ability to lay those cables. And so as, I haven't done this, I haven't figured out the exact how far you would want those first ones to go before you laid that cable connecting the two grids. You have one at Ecuador, you have one side at Ecuador, you have one side with branches off to Indonesia, the Philippines. On the other side, you have Brazil. That goes around. There's a branch off to India to power Asia. You have so Brazil to I think Nigeria. This is a 100-year project, right? What we're talking about is building the largest energy company on planet Earth, right? Connecting the world's grids, and it's going to be a long battle. It's going to be hard, but it's compounding, right? So it's going to take a lot of work to get to the first one, the second one less so, and then now you're just duplicating from there. And yeah. So when will that go live? I have no idea. When will we get to Mars? Again, never. I don't. But I don't. This is actually a realistic vision. I don't think we're ever going to go to Mars.
Really? It's funny because I feel like I've met so many more people that see Mars as something so much more feasible. And listening to you here, it's just mind blowing where I can follow the steps and see how it happens, especially if the technology to actually execute on it's available. It seems like it makes sense to do something like this, especially if the economics
Everything
make
exists.
sense.
It's
Yeah.
ocean thermal is a dumb technology, kind of like Bitcoin, right? It sounds fancy, but it's really simple. It's a Rankine cycle. It's a steam engine. We've had these things for 150 years. We're really good at making turbines. Heat exchangers are prime for an assembly line. You just get a roll of titanium, punch plates. You gasket them up, smush them together. Not a lot of human interaction, so those cost curves come down. The pipes, HDPE, easy to extrude. They're building a new 4 meter extrusion, 4 meter in diameter pipe extrusion, factory in Ecuador. So that's very that was a good piece of knowledge to know, because that makes transport to the Indo-Pacific very, very simple. And I mean, all of this technology just exists. You don't have to invent anything. You don't have to it's not going to blow up as we saw last week or 2 weeks ago. It's boats, baby. We've been sailing the oceans. The Polynesians, were colonizing the Pacific thousands of years ago, right? Boats. We know boats. We know the ocean. Space. You can't survive in space.
Well, I love the vision that you've painted here, and I definitely want to stay up to date with how the project's going. For everyone listening, where can they connect with you and the company, and how can they show support for whatever it is that you're working on?
Sure. So follow Michael and myself. I'm Nate Hawaii on Twitter. Michael is Michael Hawaii. Our website is oceanbitenergy.com. We have a Substack that you can get to through the website. Reach out. Generally, I read my DMs, but through the website is easier. I'll go days without checking Twitter. I'm not super active on it. I got better things to do, right?
Yeah, it can be a huge time sink.
Yeah. Reach out through the website. We have a contact form. We're looking for the amount of people who have reached out to us who have if you're a mechanical engineer, if you're working in a shipyard, if you're anything tangentially related, staffing up is this is what we're getting into. We're about to go we're hiring, and we're going to be hiring. We're going to throw we need a lot of bodies. So if you have any background engineering, reach out and we can find a place for you.
Well, I absolutely love seeing not only hearing the vision, but following you from afar to a certain degree on Twitter and some of the other podcasts and things that you've been on. I before we started recording, I broke out my best Hawaiian shirt for the occasion here. So I really appreciate you coming on, man. This has been great. I'll have to meet up with your co-founder in Miami at Bitcoin 2023, but we'll have to meet up sometime and do another podcast recording. This was a lot of fun. I learned so much. This might be the podcast where I've learned the most out of any other podcast, because this is just a completely new realm for me.
The ocean, man. The ocean is is magical. And it was awesome being here, William. I really enjoyed it. Yeah, Michael would be, Michael's on the business. I'm the vision. Michael's the serious business person. And he's great. Yeah.
All right. And that's all I wanted to cover in today's episode. We're dedicated to bring you high quality content, so your support means the world to us. So don't forget to smash that like button and subscribe to this channel if you want to see more of this cutting edge content. Thank you so much. I'll see you next time.